Chapter 6: The Challenges of Cultural Diversity. Different kinds of social institutions, ranging from the family to the market, can bring people together, create strong collective identities, and strengthen social cohesion. As we learned in Chapter 3 and 4, but on the other hand, on Chapter 4 and 5 showed, the very same institution can also be sources of inequality and exclusion. In this chapter, you will learn about some of the tensions and difficulties associated with cultural diversity. What precisely does cultural diversity mean, and why is it seen as a challenge? The term diversity emphasizes differences rather than inequalities. When we say that India is a nation of great cultural diversity, we mean that there are many different types of social groups and communities living here. These are communities defined by cultural markers such as language, religion, sect, race, or caste. When these diverse communities are also part of a larger entity like a nation, then difficulties may be created by competition or conflict between them. This is why cultural diversity can present tough challenges. The difficulties arise from the fact that cultural identities are very powerful. They can arouse intense passions and are often able to mobilize large number of people. Sometimes cultural differences are accompanied by economic and social inequalities, and this further complicates things. Measures to address the inequalities or injustices suffered by one community can provoke opposition from other communities. The situation is made worse when scarce resources like river waters, jobs, or government funds have to be shared. If you read newspaper regularly or watch the news on television, you may often have had the depressing feeling that India has no future. There seem to be so many divisive forces hard at work tearing apart the unity and integrity of our country. Communal riots, demands for regional autonomy, caste wars. You might have even felt upset that large section of our population are not being patriotic and don't seem to feel an intensely for India as you and your classmates do. But if you look at any book dealing with the history of modern India or books dealing specifically with the issues like communalism or regionalism, you will realize that these problems are not new ones. Almost all major divisive problems of today have been there ever since independence or even earlier. But in spite of them, India has not only survived as a nation but is stronger nation state today. As you prepare to read on, remember that this chapter deals with difficult issues for which there are no easy answers. But some answers are better than others, and it is our duty as citizens to try our utmost to produce the best answers that are possible within the limitations of our historical and social context. Remember also that, given the immense challenges presented by a vast and extremely diverse collection of peoples and cultures, India has, on the whole, done fairly well compared to the most of the nations. On the other hand, we also have some significant shortcomings. There is a lot of room for improvement, and work needs to be done in order to face the challenges of the future. Cultural communities and the nation state. Before discussing the major challenges that diversity poses in India, issues such as regionalism, communalism, and casteism, we need to understand the relationship between nation state and cultural communities. Why is it so important for people to belong to communities based on cultural identities like a caste, ethnic group, region, or religion? Why is so much passion aroused when there is perceived threat, insult, or injustice to one's community? Why do these passions pose problems for the nation state? The importance of community identity. Every human being needs a sense of stable identity to operate in this world. Questions like who am I? How am I different from others? How do others understand and comprehend me? What goals and aspirations should I have? Constantly crop up in our life right from childhood. We are able to answer many of these questions because of the way in which we are socialized or taught how to live in society by our immediate families and our community in various senses. The socialization process involves a continuous dialogue, negotiation, and even struggle against significant others like our parents, family, kin group, and our community. Our community provides us language and the cultural values through which we comprehend the world. It also anchors our self identity. Community identity is based on the birth and belonging rather than on some form of acquired qualifications or accomplishment. It is what we are rather than what we have become. We don't have to do anything to be born into a community. In fact, no one has any choice about which family or community or country they are born into. These kinds of identities are called ascriptive. That is, they are determined by the accidents of birth and do not involve any choice on the part of the individuals concerned. It is an odd fact of social life that people feel a deep sense of security and satisfaction in belonging to communities in which their membership is entirely accidental. We identify so strongly with communities we have done nothing to deserve, passed no exam, demonstrated no skill or competence. This is very unlike belonging to, say, a profession or team. Doctors or architects have to pass exams and demonstrate their competence. Even in sports, a certain level of skill and performance are a necessary precondition for membership in a team. But our membership in our families or religious or regional communities is without preconditions, and yet it is total, in fact, not restrictive. Identities are very hard to shake off. Even if we choose to disown them, others may continue to identify us by those very markers of belonging. Perhaps it is because of this accidental, unconditional, and yet almost inescapable belonging that we can often be so emotionally attached to community identity. Expanding and overlapping circles of community ties give meaning to our world, give us a sense of identity of who we are. This is why people often react emotionally or even violently whenever there is perceived threat to their community identity. A second feature of ascriptive identities and community feeling is that they are universal. Everyone has a motherland, a mother tongue, a family, a faith. This may not necessarily be strictly true of every individual, but it is true in a general sense, and we are all equally committed and loyal to our respective identities. Once again, it is possible to come across people who may not be particularly committed to one or other aspect of their identity. But the possibility of this commitment is potentially available to most people. Because of this, conflicts that involve our communities are very hard to deal with. Each side in the conflict consists of other side of a hated enemy, and there is a tendency to exaggerate the virtues of one's own side as well as the vices of the other side. Thus, the two nations are at war. Patriots in each nation see other as the enemy. Aggressor, each side believes that God and truth are on their side. In the heat of the moment, it is very hard for people on either side to see that they are constructing matching but reverse mirror images of each other. It is a social fact that no country or group ever mobilizes its members to struggle for untruth, injustice, or inequality. Everyone is always fighting for truth, justice, and equality. This does not mean that both sides are right in every conflict, equally wrong or right at other times. History may judge one side to be aggressor and other to be the victim, but this can only happen long after the heat of the conflict has cooled down. Some notion of mutually agreed upon truth is very hard to establish in situations of identity conflict. It usually takes decades, sometimes centuries, for one side to accept that it was wrong. Communities, nations, and nation states. At the simplest level, a nation is a sort of large scale community. It is a community of communities. Members of a nation share the desire to be a part of the same political collectivity. This desire for political unity usually expresses itself as an aspiration to form a state in its most general sense. The term state refers to an abstract entity consisting of a set of political legal constitutions claiming control over a particular geographical territory and the people living in it. In Max Weber's well known definition, a state is a body that successfully claims a monopoly of legitimate force in a particular territory. A nation is a peculiar sort of community that is easy to describe but hard to define. We know that we can describe many specific nations founded on the basis of common cultural, historical, and political institutions like a shared religion, language, ethnicity, history, or regional culture. But it is hard to come up with any defining measures, any characteristic that a nation must possess. For every possible criteria, there are exceptions and counterexamples. For example, there are many nations and do not share a single common language, religion, ethnicity, and so on. On the other hand, there are many languages, religions, or ethnicities that are shared across nations, but this does not lead to the formation of a single unified nation of, say, all English speakers or all of all Buddhists. How then we can distinguish a nation from other kind of communities such as ethnic group, a religious community, or a regionally defined community? Conceptually, there seems to be no hard distinction. Any of other types of community can one day form a nation. Conversely, no particular kind of community can be guaranteed to form a nation. The criteria that comes closest to distinguishing a nation is the state. Unlike the other kinds of communities mentioned before, nations are communities that have a state of their own. That is why the two are joined with a hyphen to form the term nation state. Generally speaking, in recent times, there has been a one-to-one bond between nation and state. But this is a new development. It was not true in the past that a single state could represent only one nation or that every nation must have its own state. For example, but when it was in existence, the Soviet Union explicitly recognized that people it governed were of different nations and more than 100 such internal nationalities were recognized. Similarly, people constituting a nation may actually be citizens or residents of different states. For example, there are more Jamaicans living outside Jamaica than in Jamaica. That is, the population of non-resident Jamaicans exceed that of resident Jamaicans. A different example is provided by dual citizenship law. These laws allow citizens of a particular state to also simultaneously be citizens of another state. Let us cite one instance: Jewish Americans may be citizens of Israel as well as USA. They can even serve in the armed forces of one country without losing their citizenship in the other country. In short, today it is hard to define a nation in any way other than to say that it is a community that has succeeded in acquiring a state of its own. Interestingly, the opposite has also become increasingly true. Just as would-be or aspiring nationalities are now more and more likely to work towards forming a state, existing states are also finding it more and more necessary to claim that they represent a nation. One of the characteristic features of modern era is the establishment of democracy and nationalism as dominant sources of political legitimacy. This means that today the nation is the most accepted or proper justification for a state, while the people are the ultimate source of legitimacy of nation. In other words, states need the nation as much or even more than nation needs states. But as we have seen in the preceding paragraphs, there is no historically fixed or logically necessary relationship between a nation state and the varied forms of community that it could be based on. This means that there is no predetermined answer to this question. How should the state part of the nation state treat the different kinds of community that make up the nation part? As is shown in box 6.2 Most states generally been suspicious of cultural diversity and have tried to reduce or eliminate it. However, there are many successful examples, including India, which show that it is perfectly possible to have a strong nation state without having a homogenize different types of community identities into one standard type. Policies that promote assimilation are aimed at persuading, encouraging, or forcing all citizens to adopt a uniform set of cultural values and norms. These values and norms are usually entirely or largely those of the dominant social group. Other non dominant or subordinated groups in the society are expected or required to give up their own cultural values and adopt the prescribed ones. Policies promoting integration are different in style but not in overall objective. They insist that the public culture be restricted to a common national pattern, while all non national cultures are to be relegated to the private sphere. In this case, too, there is danger of dominant groups' culture being treated as national culture. You can probably see what the problem is by now. There is no necessary relationship between any specific form of community and the modern form of the state. Any of the many bases of community identity may or may not lead to nation formation. There are no guarantees. But because community identities can act as the basis for nation formation, already existing state see all forms of community identity as dangerous rivals. That is why states generally tend to favor a single, homogeneous national identity in the hope of being able to control and manage it. However, suppressing cultural diversity can be very costly in terms of alienation of the minority or subordinated communities whose culture is treated as non national. Moreover, the very act of suppression can provoke the opposite effect of intensifying community identity, so encouraging at least allowing cultural diversity is good policy from both the practical and the principled point of view. Cultural diversity in the India in nation state an overview. The Indian nation state is socially and culturally one of the most diverse countries in the world. It has a population of 1.21 billion people according to Census of India 2011. Currently the world's second largest and soon to become the largest nation population in the world. These billion plus people to speak about 1632 different languages and dialects. As many as 18 of these languages have been officially recognized and placed under the 8th schedule of constitution, thus guaranteeing their legal status. In terms of religion, about 80.5% of the population are Hindu, who in turn are regionally specific, plural in beliefs and practices, and divided by caste and languages. About 13.4% of the population are Muslims, which make India the world's third largest Muslim country after Indonesia and Pakistan. The other major religions communities are Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. Because of India's huge population, these small percentage can also add up to large absolute numbers. In terms of nation-state relationship with community identities, the Indian case fits neither in the assimilationist nor the integrationist model prescribed in Marx. For its very beginning, the independent Indian state has ruled out an assimilationist model. However, the demand for such a model has been expressed by some section of dominant Hindu community. Although national integration is a constant theme state policy, India has not been integrationist. The constitution declares the state to be a secular state, but religion, language, and other such factors are not banished from the public sphere. In fact, these communities have been explicitly recognized by the state. By international standards, very strong constitutional protection is offered to minority religions. In general, India's problems have been more in the sphere of implementation and practice rather than laws or principles. But on the whole, India can be considered a good example of state nation, though it is not entirely free from the problems common to nation states. Regionalism in the Indian context. Regionalism in India is rooted in India's diversity of languages, cultures, tribes, and religions. It is also encouraged by the geographical concentration of those identity markers in particular regions and fueled by a sense of regional deprivation. Indian federalism has been a means of accommodating these regional sentiments. After independence, initially the Indian state continued with the British Indian arrangement, dividing India into large provinces, also called presidencies. These were large multi ethnic and multilingual provincial states constituting the major political administrative units of a semi federal state called the Union of India. For example, the old Bombay state was a multilingual state of Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, and Konkani speaking people. Similarly, the Madras state was constituted by Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam speaking people. In addition to the presidencies and provinces directly administered by the British Indian government, there were also a large number of princely states and principalities all over India. The larger princely states included Mysore, Kashmir, and Baroda, but soon after the adoption of the constitution, all these units of the colonial era had to be reorganized into ethno-linguistic states within the Indian Union in response to strong popular agitations. Language coupled with regional and tribal identity and not religion has therefore provided the most powerful instrument for the formation of ethno-national identity in India. However, this does not mean that all communities have got statehood. For instance, in the creation of three new states in 2000, namely Chhattisgarh, Uttaranchal, and Jharkhand, language did not play a prominent role. Rather, a combination of ethnicity based on tribal identity, language, regional deprivation, and ecology provided the basis of intense regionalism, resulting in statehood. Currently, there are 28 states and 7 union territories within the Indian nation state. Now, in this chapter, the word state has a capital S when it is used to denote the federal units within the Indian nation state. The lowercase state is used for the broader conceptual category described above. Respecting regional sentiments is just not a matter of creating states. This has to be backed up with a institutional structure that ensures their viability as relatively autonomous units within a larger federal structure. In India, this is done by constitutional provisions defining the powers of the states and center. There are a list of subjects or areas of governance which are exclusive responsibility of either state or center, along with a concurrent list of areas where both are allowed to operate. The state legislature determines the composition of the upper house of parliament, the Rajya Sabha. In addition, there are periodic committees and commissions that decide on center-state relations. An example is the Finance Commission, which is set up every 10 years to decide on sharing of tax revenues between center and states. Each 5-year plan involves detailed state plans prepared by the state planning commissions of each state. On the whole, the federal system has worked fairly well, though there remain many contentious issues. Since the era of liberalization, there is concern among policymakers, politicians, and scholars about increasing inter-regional economic and infrastructure inequalities as private investment is given greater role in economic development. Consideration of regional equity gets diluted. This happens because private investors generally want to invest in already developed states where the infrastructure and other facilities are better. Unlike private industry, the government can give some consideration to regional equity rather than just seek to maximize profit. So left to itself, the market economy tends to increase the gap between developed and backward regions. Fresh public initiatives will be needed to reverse the current trends. The nation state and religion related issues and identities, perhaps the most contentious of all aspects of cultural diversity, are issues relating to religious communities and religion based identities. These issues may be broadly divided into two related groups: secularism, communalism set, and the minority majority set. Question of secularism and communalism are about the state's relationship to religion and to political groupings that invoke religion as their primary identity. Questions about minorities and majorities involve decisions on how the state is to treat different religions, ethnic, or other communities that are unequal in terms of members and or power. Minority rights and nation building. In Indian nationalism, the dominant trend was marked by an inclusive and democratic vision. Inclusive because it recognized diversity and plurality. Democratic because it sought to do away with discrimination and exclusion and bring forth a just and equitable society. The term people has not been seen in exclusive terms as referring to any specific group defined by religion, ethnicity, race, or caste. Ideas of humanism influenced Indian nationalists, and the ugly aspects of exclusive nationalism were extensively commented upon by leading figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. To be effective, the ideas of inclusive nationalism had to be built into the constitution, for, as already discussed, there is a very strong tendency for the dominant group to assume that their culture or language or religion is synonymous with the nation state. However, for a strong and democratic nation, special constitutional provisions are required to ensure the rights of all groups and those of minority groups in particular. A brief discussion on the definition of minorities will enable us to appreciate the importance of safeguarding minority rights for a strong, united, and democratic nation. The notion of minority groups is widely used in sociology and is more than a merely numerical distinction. It usually involves some sense of relative disadvantage. Thus, the privileged minorities, such as extremely wealthy people, are not usually referred to as minorities. If they are, the term is qualified in some way, as in the phrase privileged minority. When minority is used without qualification, it generally implies a relatively small but also disadvantaged group. The sociological sense of minority also implies that the members of minority form a collectively, that is, they have a strong sense of group solidarity, a feeling of togetherness and belonging. This is linked to disadvantage because the experience is being subjected to prejudice, and discrimination usually heightens feelings of intra-group loyalty and interest. Thus, groups that may be minorities in a statistical sense, such as people who are left-handed or people born on 29th February, are not minorities in the sociological sense because they do not form a collectivity. However, it is possible to have anomalous instances where a minority group is disadvantaged in one sense but not in another. Thus, for example, religious minorities like the Parsis or Sikhs may be relatively well off economically, but they may still be disadvantaged in a cultural sense because of their small numbers relative to the overwhelming majority of Hindus. Religious or cultural minorities need special protection because of the demographic dominance of the majority. In democratic politics, it is always possible to convert a numerical majority into political power. Through elections, this means that religious or cultural minorities, regardless of their economic or social position, are politically vulnerable. They must face the risk that the majority community will capture political power and use the state machinery to suppress their religious or cultural institutions, ultimately forcing them to abandon their distinctive identity. In the long year of struggle against British colonialism, Indian nationalists understood that imperative need to recognize and respect India's diversity. Indeed, unity in diversity became a shorthand to capture the plural and diverse nature of Indian society. Discussion on Minority and cultural rights mark many of the deliberations of Indian National Congress and final expression of Indian Constitution. The makers of Indian Constitution were aware that a strong and united nation could be built only by all the sections of people had the freedom to practice their religion and to develop their culture and language. Dr. B. R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of Constitution, made this point clear in the Constituent Assembly. In the last 3 decades, we have witnessed how non-recognition of the rights of different groups of people in a country can have grave implications for national unity. One of the key issues that led to formation of Bangladesh was the unwillingness of Pakistani state to recognize the culture and linguistic rights of the people of Bangladesh. One of the many contentious issues that formed the backdrop of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka was the imposition of Sinhalese as a national language. Likewise, any forcible imposition of a language or religion on any group of people in India weakens national unity, which is based upon recognition of differences. Indian nationalism recognizes this and Indian constitution affirms this. Finally, it is useful to note that minorities exist everywhere, not just in India. In most nation states, there tend to be a dominant social group, whether cultural, ethnic, racial, or religious. Nowhere in the world is there a nation state consisting exclusively of a single homogeneous cultural group. Even where this was almost true, modern capitalism, colonialism, and large scale migration have brought in a plurality of groups. Even the smallest state will have minorities, whether in religious, ethnic, linguistic, or racial terms. Communalism, secularism, and nation state. Communalism in everyday language. The word communalism refers to aggressive chauvinism based on religious identity. Chauvinism itself is an attitude that sees one's own group as the only legitimate or the worthy group, with other groups being seen by definition as inferior, illegitimate, and opposed. Thus, to simplify further, communalism is an aggressive political ideology linked to religion. This is peculiarly in India or perhaps South Asian, meaning that is different from the sense of ordinary English word. In English language, communal means something related to community or collectively as different from an individual. The English meaning is neutral, whereas the South Asian meaning is strongly charged. The charge may be seen as positive if one is sympathetic to communalism or negative if one is opposed to it. It is important to emphasize that communalism is about politics, not about religion. Although communalists are intensely involved with religion, there is in fact no necessary relationship between personal faith and communalism. A communalist may or may not be a devout person. A devout believers may or may not be communalist. However, all communalists do believe in political identity based on religion. The key factor is the attitude towards those who believe in other kinds of identities, including other religion based identities. Communalists cultivate an aggressive political identity and are prepared to condemn or attack everyone who do not share their identity. One of the characteristic features of communalism is its claim that religious identity overrides everything else, whether one is rich or poor, whatever one's occupation, caste, or political beliefs. It is religion alone that counts. All Hindus are the same, as are all Muslims, Sikhs, and so on. This has the effect of constructing large and diverse groups as singular and homogeneous. It is noteworthy that this is done for one's own group as well as for others. This would obviously rule out the possibility that Hindus, Muslims, and Christians who belong to Kerala, then with their core religion is from Kashmir, Gujarat, or Nagaland. It also denies the possibility that, for instance, landless agricultural laborers may have a lot in common even if they belong to different religion and regions. Communalism is an especially important issue in India because it has been a recurrent source of tension and violence. During communal rights, people become faceless members of their respective communities. They are willing to kill, rape and loot members of other communities in order to redeem their pride, to protect their home turf. A commonly cited justification is to avenge death or dishonor suffered by their co-religionists elsewhere or even in the distant past. No region has been wholly exempt from communal violence of one kind or other. Every religious community has faced this violence in greater or lesser degree, although the proportionate impact is far more dramatic for minority communities. To the extent that governments can be held responsible for communal rights, no government or ruling party can claim to be blameless in this regard. In fact, the two most dramatic contemporary instances of communal violence incurred under each of the major political parties, the anti-Sikh riots of Delhi in 1984 took place under a Congress regime. The unprecedented scale and spread of anti-Muslim violence in Gujarat in 2002 took place under BJP government. India had a history of communal riots from pre-independence times, often as a result of divide and rule policy adopted by colonial rulers. But colonialism did not invent inter-community conflicts. There is also a long history of pre-colonial conflicts, and it certainly cannot be blamed for post-independence riots and killings. Indeed, we wish to look for instances of religious, cultural, regional, or ethnic conflict. They can be found in almost every phase of our history. But we will not forget that we also have a long tradition of religious pluralism, ranging from peaceful coexistence to actual intermixing or syncretism. This syncretic heritage is clearly evident in the devotional songs and poetry of the Bhakti and Sufi movements. In short, history provides us with both good and bad examples. What we wish to learn from it is up to us. Secularism, as we have seen above, the meanings of the terms communal and communalism are more or less clear, despite the bitter controversies between supporters and opponents. By contrast, the terms secular, and secularism are very hard to define clearly, although they are also equally controversial. In fact, secularism is among the most complex terms in social and political theory. In the Western context, the main sense of these terms has to do with the separation of church and state. The separation of religion and political authority marked a major turning point in the social history of the West. This separation was related to the process of secularization or the progressive retreat of religion from public life, as it was converted from a mandatory obligation to a voluntary personal practice. Secularization, in turn, was related to the arrival of modernity and the rise of science and rationality as alternatives to religious ways of understanding the world. The Indian meanings of secular and secularism include the Western sense but also involve others. The most common use of secular in everyday language is as opposite of communal. So, a secular person or state is that does not favor any particular religion over others. Secularism in this sense is the opposite of religious sovereignism, and it not need necessarily imply hostility to religion as such. In terms of state-religion relationship, this sense of secularism implies equal respect for all religions rather than separation or distancing. For example, the secular Indian state declares public holidays to the mark festivals of religions all. One kind of difficulty is created by the tension between the Western sense of maintaining distance from all religions and the Indian sense of state giving equal respect to all religions. Supporters of each sense are upset by whatever the state to uphold the other sense. Should a secular state provide subsidies for Hajj pilgrimage or manage Tirupati Tirumala temple complex or support pilgrimage to Himalayan holy places? Should all religious holidays be abolished, leaving only Independence Day, Republic Day, Gandhi Jayanti and Ambedkar Jayanti for example? Should a secular state ban cow slaughter because cows are holy for a particular religion? If it does so, should it also ban pig slaughter because another religion prohibits eating of pork? If Sikh soldiers in the army are allowed to have long hair and wear turbans, should Hindu soldiers also be allowed to shave their heads, or Muslim soldiers allowed to have long beards? Questions of this sort lead to passionate disagreements that are hard to settle. Another set of complications is created by the tension between the Indian state's simultaneous commitment to secularism as well as protection of minorities. The protection of minorities requires that they be given special consideration in a context where the normal working of political system places them at disadvantage vis-a-vis the majority community. But providing such protection immediately invites the accusation of favoritism or appeasement of minorities. Opponents argue that secularism of this sort is only an excuse to favor the minorities in return for their votes or other kinds of support. Supporters argue that without such special protection, secularism can turn into an excuse for imposing the majority community's value and norms on the minorities. These kind of controversies becomes harder to solve when political parties and social movements develop a vested interest in keeping them alive. In recent times, communalists of all regions have contributed to the deadlock. The resurgence and newly acquired political power of Hindu communalists has added a further dimension of complexity. Clearly, a lot of needs to be done to improve our understanding of secularism as a principle and our practice of it as a policy. But despite everything, it is true that India's constitution and legal structure has proved to be reasonably effective in handling the problems created by various kinds of communalism. The first generation of leaders of independent India chose to have liberal secular state governed by a democratic constitution. According to the state was conceived in culturally neutral terms, and the nation was also conceived as an inclusive, territorial, political community of all citizens. Nation building was viewed mainly as a state driven process of economic development and social transformation. The expectation was that the universalization of citizenship rights and the induction of cultural pluralities into democratic process of open and competitive politics would evolve new civic equations among ethnic communities and between them the state. These expectations may not have materialized in the manner expected, but ever since independence, the people of India, through their direct political participation and election verdicts, have repeatedly asserted their support for a secular constitution and state. Their voices should count. State and civil society. You may have noticed that much of this chapter have been concerned with the state. The state is indeed a very crucial institution when it comes to management of cultural diversity in a nation. Although it claims to represent the nation, the state can also become somewhat independent of the nation and its people to the extent that the state structure, legislature, bureaucracy, judiciary, armed forces, police and other arms of the state becomes insulated from the people. It has the potential of turning authoritarian. An authoritarian state is the opposite of a democratic state. It is a state in which the people have no voice and those in power are not accountable to anyone. Authoritarian states often limit or abolish civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of political activity, right to protection from wrongful use of authority, right to the due process of the law, and so on. Apart from authoritarianism, there is also possibility that the state institution become unable or unwilling to respond to the needs of the people because of corruption, inefficiency or lack of resources. In short, there are many reasons why a state may not be all that it should be. Not state actors and institutions became important in this context, for they can keep a watch on state protest against its injustices or supplement its efforts. Civil society is a name given to the broad arena in which lies beyond the private domain of the family but outside the domain of both state and market. Civil society is the non-state and non-market part of the public domain in which individual gets together voluntarily to create institution and organization. It is sphere of active citizenship. Here individuals take up social issues, try to seek support for a variety of causes. It consists of voluntary associations, organizations, institutions formed by a group of citizens. It includes NGOs, trade unions, media institutions, political parties, religious organizations, and other kind of collective entities. The main criteria for inclusion in civil society are that the organization should not be state controlled and it should not be purely commercial profit making entity. Thus, Doordarshan is not part of civil society through private televisions are. A car manufacturing company is not a part of civil society, but the trade unions to which its workers belong are. Of course, these criteria allow for a lot to grey areas. For example, a newspaper may be run like a purely commercial enterprise, or an NGO may be supported by government funds. The Indian people had a brief experience of authoritarian rule during the emergency enforced between June 1975 and January 1977. Parliament was suspended and new laws were made directly by the government. Civil liberties were revoked and a large number of politically active people were arrested and jailed without trial. Censorship was imposed on the media and government officials could be dismissed without normal procedures. The government coerced lower level officials to implement its program and produce instant results. The most notorious was the forced sterilization campaign in which large numbers died due to surgical complications. When elections were held unexpectedly in the early 1977, people voted overwhelmingly against the ruling Congress party. The emergency shocked people into active participation and helped energize the many civil society initiatives that emerged in the 1970s. This period saw resurgence of a wide variety of social movements, including the women's, environmental, human rights, and the Dalit movements. Today, the activities of civil society organizations have an even wider range, including advocacy and lobbying activity with national and international agencies, as well as active participation in various movements. The issues taken up diverse, ranging from tribal struggles from land rights, revolution in urban governance, campaigns against rape and violence against women, rehabilitation of those displaced by dams, and other developmental projects. Fishermen's struggles against mechanized fishing, rehabilitation of hawkers and pavement dwellers, campaigns against slum demolitions and for housing rights, primary education reform, distribution of lands and Dalits, and so on. Civil liberties organizations have been particularly important in keeping a watch on state and forcing it to obey the law. The media too has taken an increasingly active role, especially its emergent visual and electronic segments. Among the most significant recent initiatives is the campaign for the right to information, beginning with an agitation in rural Rajasthan for the release of information on government funds spent on village development. This effort grew into a nationwide campaign despite the resistance of the bureaucracy. The government was forced to respond to the campaign and pass a new law formally acknowledging the citizens' rights to information. Example of this sort illustrate the crucial importance of civil society in ensuring that the state is accountable to the nation and its people.